The Twitter files are back as authors Michael Shellenberger and Matt Taibbi made their triumphant return to Capitol Hill during a hearing that discussed the extent of social media censorship at the hands of government. The pair condemned the actions of companies like Twitter, who used their vast reach to censor content like the Hunter Biden laptop story that was true, but they didn't like during the 2020 election. Watch.
Oh, yeah. Well, then the Aspen Institute, this was the weirdest thing. We discovered that Aspen Institute had created a workshop that it was attended by basically all of the major media, including as well as all the major social media platforms, to basically pre-bunk in advance the Hunter Biden laptop, even though it had not been, there was no evidence that it existed outside of the fact that the FBI knew that they had it because they got it in December 2019. So to have the Aspen Institute trying to persuade people not to cover the Hunter Biden laptop story in August and September of 2020 was quite chilling and disturbing to see.
Taibbi noted that the people doing the censorship were not members of the working class, but instead unaccountable elites that seemed hell-bent on telling average Americans what to do.
If one small demographic over here has broad control over the whole speech landscape, and a great big one over there has no control whatsoever, it follows that one of those groups will end up with more political power than the other. Which one is the winner? To paraphrase our Glasser, it probably ain't yours. It isn't just one side or the other that will lose if these programs are allowed to continue. It's pretty much everyone, which is why these programs must be defunded before it's too late.
Congressional Democrats used their time to attack Taibbi and Shellenberger. One notable moment came when New York Congressman Dan Goldman asserted that the Hunter Biden laptop story was a lie and that former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani could have been involved.
You have no idea. You know hard drives can be manipulated.
Are you suggesting the New York Post participated in a conspiracy to construct the contents of the Hunter Biden laptop?
No, sir. The problem is that hard drives can be manipulated by Rudy Giuliani or Russia.
Well, what's the evidence that happened?
Well, there is actual evidence of it, but the point is it's not the same.
There's no evidence for it, so you're engaging in a conspiracy.
I'm glad.
I mean, let's start with the obvious. There was no evidence that there was ever any manipulation of the Hunter Biden hard drive, as was published by the New York Post. And yet we saw that these big tech companies, from Twitter to Facebook, took the New York Post off of the platform for a period of time and banned any discussion of the story. You weren't allowed to share links from it. And that was encouraged by the Biden administration, which helped coordinate this signed letter from former intelligence officers claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop had all the marks of disinformation. And so it's really troubling that these Democrats on this committee continue to attack the messengers of Shellenberger and Taibbi for merely reporting on the internal Twitter documents that show the coordination between government and big tech companies to censor the speech of Americans, rather than taking these threats to the First Amendment seriously, Jessica.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how long of a practice has been and how much focus it's gotten since the Twitter files have come out. It's been pretty much standard procedure that if something is deemed a national security risk, it's taken down from not just online platforms, but from media in general. This has been a very long practice and a relationship that private corporations have had for the government for a very long time. You can ask folks working in the State Department, they don't even bat an eye when you talk about something like this. And so the Twitter files giving it all of this attention begs the question, would people be just as outraged if they found out the collusion that was going on between, the CIA and the New York Times, whether there was a deliberate conversation to be had between editors or authors at the Times and the CIA is beside the point. It's very obvious that during the time of the 70s and the 80s, a lot of the foreign affairs reporting really complemented CIA policy. And so to me, the tying together of the state and media is much bigger than just social media. We give a lot of focus to social media, but corporations really buy and sell a lot of what has been said on cable news and mainstream media. And so the problem's much bigger than just this. But what's fascinating about this hearing is seeing it get derailed. And now we're talking about the Hunter Biden laptop instead of just the Twitter files, because members of both sides are just so craven to protect their party identity and their party beliefs, even if it has absolutely nothing to do with the issue at hand.
I would challenge the notion that the laptop doesn't have anything to do with the issue at hand, though, because it was a sort of perfect example of the type of censorship that was engaged in by Twitter and by Facebook in the run-up to the 2020 election. Of course, it wasn't the only example. They also, of course, in the Twitter files talk about the censorship of information related to COVID-19 that was deemed conspiratorial when it ended up being true. For example, the idea that the vaccine wouldn't prevent you from getting or spreading the virus, or the idea that social distancing, the whole 5 feet or 6 feet rule was totally arbitrary. There were tons of women sharing their stories of adverse effects on their fertility by the vaccine. They were told that they were crazy, and Twitter took those stories down, only to find out a few months later from reporting from places like the New York Times and the Washington Post that there were effects on women's menstrual cycles and fertility from the vaccine. And the Biden administration, it was ruled by a federal appeals court recently that they had overstepped on the First Amendment by coordinating with social media companies to censor that information. And I know it's true that this happens on both sides of the aisle. There were social media accounts in the run-up to the 2016 election that were deemed bots because they were supporting Bernie, and you had Hillary Clinton calling for those people to be censored. So it's not exclusive to any one party or any one political persuasion, but the Twitter files make clear that the real problem here is that when government gets involved in this situation where they are actively making decisions about what is misinformation or disinformation or what violates a private company's terms of service, that becomes a First Amendment issue.
Yeah, I think the Shellenberger and members of Congress debating whether or not Rudy Giuliani, the New York Times, or others tampered with a hard drive. Clearly, there's no evidence of that. That back and forth, if you're a lawmaker, none of that is pertinent to you passing legislation regarding censorship whatsoever. I just felt that to be entirely unnecessary in this hearing. But what I really appreciate is that you have members of Congress approaching this from the perspective of, okay, these are private corporations. How different, and I don't know if they had this deliberate thought in their line of questioning or not. It's definitely a thought that I have. How deliberate would it be for, someone in another business to talk to Twitter and say, you know what, I advertise on Twitter, and I have a lot of concerns about the speech that's happening. It would be in Twitter's rights as a private business to say, you know what, we're adjusting our terms and conditions. We're actually changing how we do things, and we're not going to allow content like this on the app because it's not safe for business for Twitter, because it's upsetting their advertisers. Similarly, the federal government can reach out to a private corporation without requiring them by law to do anything and say, hey, this is what we're observing. We just wanted to share this information with you. We're worried about misinformation with the vaccine. Here's the info we have. But you're a private company, make your own decision. And then they go on to make the decision to censure. Is that really the federal government controlling a corporation and infringing on free speech? And that's the territory really that we're in. A big question I have, you mentioned the Bernie campaign. Matt Taibbi was a Bernie supporter. A lot of leftists have the question, why were the Twitter files not keyword searched for anything regarding the Bernie campaign? Bernie bros, Bernie, not me, us, anything to do with Bernie. They didn't feel the need to assess the degree of lefty censorship on Twitter, which honestly just makes me question Matt Taibbi's and Shellenberger's intentions with the Twitter files.
Yeah, I wish they would do that. And if they still have access to it, they definitely should. I would say that the problem with the government getting involved in these situations in terms of determining what violates terms of service is that there's an inherent threat when the government is going to a private corporation and asking them to make decisions like that in regards to speech, especially when we have a situation now where these tech companies are routinely brought in for depositions, for public testimony, for public hearings, and there's always that looming threat of tighter regulation if they don't abide by the government's terms. And your point about advertising is well taken, because it currently is a situation where media companies have been manipulating algorithms at Twitter to get certain results, then publishing articles claiming that Twitter is a hotbed of anti-Semitism and that ads from places like Apple and IBM are showing up next to Nazi content, and corporations are pulling their ads as a result. So Elon Musk, in response to this just the other day, said that he wasn't going to be bullied by advertisers. He wasn't going to allow that money to affect his business decisions, and told them to go F themselves. But there is always, of course, the potential threat of businesses operating based on what best affects their bottom line and changing their terms of service thereof. And one of the policy proposals that some Republicans like Josh Hawley have suggested in response to that in previous years, where it seemed like Twitter was making decisions based on advertiser dollars, was to treat them more like publishers, to treat them more like a media outlet, as a recognition that they are very much the public square now, and they need to be treating different political speech equally, as opposed to making decisions based on whether or not they agree with the content, and not just because the content violates some sort of term of service in regards to what they find objectionable.
I think it's really clear that these social media apps do occupy the space of a public square. And it's partially because the public square has been replaced by strip malls and high-rise office buildings. But it's also because a lot of people are getting information online and are communicating online. And so, of course, people want a place for free discourse, free discussion. And currently, there really isn't a place for that when everything's privately owned. The alternative being, an app owned by the government. I don't think people feel very good about that either. And striking a deal of something in between is something that it seems that big tech and the government are not on the same page about. That, they agree that, maybe this relationship is best, where we secretly share memos back and forth and ask you to censor things and so on. And then they go on and give these, hearings on the floor of Congress, and members of Congress pretend like they have no idea how social media apps work. Whether they're pretending or they really don't know, I'm not sure which is worse. But it's very obvious that there's no steps forward in regulation of censorship, if that can be a thing. There's no steps forward in ensuring that a private corporation fosters an environment for free speech. Is that something we can have in a free market capitalist society? It's a huge question. But it seems that even the lawmakers tasked with it are not asking it. But it seems that this is what the people want. Even people who really loyally support living in a free market capitalist society, they want a place that's the public square, which does mean that the corporate goal of having a safe place for advertisers is not the ultimate goal. That free speech would have to be the ultimate goal. Can we incentivize a corporation to do that in the economy we have? I think that's the main question here. And it's one that it seems that lawmakers are not asking.
Great point. We'll be back with more Rising after this.